And another thing that I haven't spoken about yet, but is quite important, is the idea that orgasmic meditation explicitly does not have an expectation of reciprocal pleasure giving. So, for example, like a woman who receives this like pleasurable sexual touch from a stroking partner, once those 15 minutes are over, the explicit understanding in an OM is that she doesn't owe her partner anything. Not a hug, a handshake, a thank you, a date, more sex. And I think for a lot of women, that can be a pretty revelatory idea because you're just brought up in a world where you're socially conditioned to believe that if someone gives you sexual pleasure, you owe them something in return.
In this new episode of Crawlspace, we are joined by award-winning journalist Ellen Huet, who is now an author and the author of a great new book called Empire of Orgasm: Sex, Power, and the Downfall of a Wellness Cult. This is a really fascinating conversation, Lance. What'd you think?
Well, I think it's like cult month here at Crawlspace. We just had a guest on, Natalie Robimed. She had done extensive research and has a great show involving Allison Mack and the cult of Nexium. And now we followed up here with Ellen Huet, and the conversation with her is no less fascinating. And what I liked about this was that Ellen gets really into this concept of a cult that always has confused me, which is when does this group, a community that people like and get benefits from, cross that line into becoming a cult? And she talks about how the face of cults, they're ever changing. And this is a really great example because it deals with intimacy, separating intimacy from actual sex. I thought it was really fascinating. What did you think?
And I think this OneTaste cult is kind of like another in a long list of cults that are kind of surrounding like wellness. And I find that fascinating, like as we keep going here in the, almost into the year 2026, how many of these cults are kind of being exposed for what they are.
Right. And it all starts with bad business practices, and it goes down to just actual abuse of their members and their employees and people within their inner circle. I think people are going to get a lot of really good information from this.
Okay, so check out the books wherever you get your books, and Ellen's got a website, ellenhuet.com, for more information.
And next week, Tuesday, November 25th, we are going to be hosting another virtual live fundraiser for our nonprofit Private Investigations for the Missing. This is going to be on our show Missing, the Missing Podcast YouTube channel. You see the option to watch us live. It's going to be at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, and we have a long list of guests that are going to be joining us. It's going to be a good time, and we're going to be raising money for such a great organization.
Yes, can't wait for that. Tuesday, November 25th, 8 p.m. Eastern on the Missing YouTube. Okay, please follow us on social media at Crawlspace Podcast or Crawlspace Pod. We are going to break real quick here for commercial, and we'll be right back with Ellen Huet.
Thanks to our sponsors, and we are back with Ellen Huet to talk about the Empire of Orgasm.
Welcome to the podcast, Ellen Huet. Ellen, how are you today?
I'm great. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much for joining us and for doing all of this amazing work on this topic. We talk about cults here, and I have a really hard time sometimes wrapping my head around a cult because I wonder, like, hey, is just like really liking yoga being a part of a cult because I pay a monthly fee, so is that the same thing? So I don't know. It just kind of makes me question my own decisions. But before we get into all of this and all of your great work, can you do a little introduction for the audience?
Sure. My name's Ellen Huet. I'm a journalist. I am a features writer at Bloomberg News and for Bloomberg Business Week. But I'm also the author of Empire of Orgasm, which is out November 18th. And is the true story of the rise and fall of a woman-led sexual wellness company that is also alleged to be a cult.
Now, why did this topic come across your desk as something you may want to write as a book?
Great question. So to give a little bit of background about OneTaste, the company, and Orgasmic Meditation, which is its main product. OneTaste is a sexual wellness company that was started in the mid-2000s that basically popularized a practice called orgasmic meditation. And orgasmic meditation is a 15-minute partnered meditative clitoral stroking practice in which a stroker, usually a man, puts on a glove and puts some lube on his left index finger and strokes the clitoris of a woman in a very prescribed way for 15 minutes exactly. And the only goal of this practice is for both parties to meditate on and really feel the sensations in their body. So there's no other goal other than that. It's not meant to be sex or foreplay or anything. And OneTaste was this company that was started by a woman named Noelle W. And so she's really like the main character of the book, Empire of Orgasm. And it's all about like the story of how she found this idea, created this company, built this entire empire that managed to really take off in the 2010s in San Francisco and beyond. They were in New York, LA, London, Australia, Europe, and how it managed to ride the wave of the wellness boom, of like female entrepreneurship, the startup boom, all these things that, you know, Noelle was kind of like the girl boss wellness like startup founder of the time. And then the stories of people who later said that they had been exploited and really taken advantage of while being part of OneTaste. So that's just a little background about like the company, the woman who started it, and the main practice that they do, because it is a lot to kind of get your head around if you've never heard of orgasmic meditation before. And the story of how I became involved is in late 2017. I was working at Bloomberg as I am now, and I was a reporter covering startups. So, you know, I'm based in San Francisco. I was covering like WeWork and other kind of, you know, the 2010s was a crazy time to be covering startups. There was a lot going on. And I got a pitch one day, as I do many, many times a day, from someone who works in PR. And she approached me and said, "Hey, I know you write about startups. I have this new client that you might be interested in. It's a fast-growing, woman-led sexual wellness startup, and they have this interesting practice, and would you like to learn more?" And I had heard about orgasmic meditation before. I'd actually read another article that someone I know had written about it. I was intrigued, as many people are. It's an intriguing topic, something that many people don't talk about, or it just makes you do a double take. You know, I had an initial meeting. I wanted to hear more about them. They kind of pitched themselves to me at the time as the Whole Foods of sexuality, saying that their practice was helping people access a more wholesome, organic, good for you type of sexuality. At the same time, I'm a journalist. I decided to kind of ask around on my own. And I ended up finding someone who had been a customer and kind of like a member, been pretty involved in OneTaste, who had had a really bad experience and felt like they had been taken advantage of, felt like they had experienced kind of like predatory sales tactics and things like that. And that was my first clue that there might be another side to this story. And so I ended up interviewing a lot of people over the course of 6 or 7 months and ended up writing this big investigation about how many former members of OneTaste called it a cult, and all these things that had happened inside the company that, you know, according to those people, seemed quite damaging. And then that set me off on this long journey. That was actually 7 years ago. And there's been so much that has happened since, which we can definitely get into. You know, I did all this research for this book. Basically, in parallel, there was also a criminal investigation going on. The FBI started investigating OneTaste. We don't know exactly when, but the first that I heard about it was a few months after that first story of mine came out. They continued investigating through COVID and through all this time. And then in 2023, they actually charged Noelle, the leader, and Rachel Cherwitz, her second in command, with a pretty serious federal crime. And then there were 2 years of like trial preparations. And then in 2025, this summer, there was a criminal trial in New York, which I went to cover. And Noelle and Rachel were actually convicted by a jury, found guilty. And now those two women are in jail in Brooklyn awaiting sentencing, which could happen later this year or early next. So that was that's the whole, like, how did I get involved? That's the whole arc. And that leads us to today, which, you know, it's really been this long and unexpected journey of writing this book and kind of the concurrent criminal trial.
When you're writing this and you're looking into these people and their business practices and the people who have given them their money in order to, or in exchange for the services, I know you said that you determined that they were cult or they had practiced cult-like behavior. Were you ever nervous that again, that definition of cult wasn't what you thought it would be. Does that make sense at all? Like, there have been cults in the past that are clearly cults, right?
I mean, this is a really complicated question. One that I have learned a lot about in the last 7 years since I wrote this first story. I was not, I'm a journalist. I've written about many things, business, crime, all these, many different topics, but I was never, I had never actually written about cult dynamics before. If you had asked me 7 years ago, like, what's the definition of a cult, I would have given kind of an off the cuff answer that was not, really that based in my own reporting or experience. What I've come to learn is that the definition of a cult is quite complicated. If you ask people who are researchers who study cults, they'll tell you, and I believe this as well, cults exist on a spectrum or a continuum from more benign to more harmful. We actually, I think, lose something when we spend too much time trying to decide, is a specific group a cult or not a cult. I actually think that binary is a bit misleading. And instead, it tends to be more interesting and more informative and more helpful, frankly, to look at certain cult dynamics and try to understand like which of those might be present in this group or which of them, might not be. And then I think you can kind of from there make more of a personal determination about whether a group is harmful or not. Nevertheless, like cult is a useful shorthand for like what some of these groups, display. And, researchers like to call it a high control group for that reason. They tend to be extractive of their members' time and money and energy. Some of the other key characteristics are things that you'll probably recognize. A charismatic leader who promises that they have some sort of divine or special knowledge, a group philosophy that promises to give like overarching answers to big questions in your life. Within OneTaste, those things existed. Like Nicole Daedone was really like the face, the visionary. I mean, frankly, continues to be the face and the visionary of OneTaste and of orgasmic meditation, even though she's behind bars. What OneTaste promised wasn't just, oh, this 15-minute clitoral stroking practice is good for you in this small way. They promised that living a life oriented around orgasmic meditation, which they also called OM, pronounced Om. So basically they were like, if you do this Om practice, your life is going to be transformed. You will have better relationships, better sex, more intimacy, a better connection with your desire, more vitality and energy. And frankly, the more involved you got, they would even say and suggest things like it's going to help you connect to like a spiritual higher power. Sometimes they use the word God. Sometimes they use the word orgasm with a capital O to mean a kind of life force, honestly, similar to the Force from Star Wars, this thing that you could tap into that was going to elevate your life. To go back to your question, like, what was it about this group? There are many characteristics. It's also like, cults, if you speak to researchers, they say, oh yeah, they tend to have really strong in-group and out-group tendencies. So it's sort of like you're either with us, or if you're an outsider, you are rejected or shunned or pitied. That was definitely present within the group, according to people who were members and talked to me about it. There are some softer qualities of a cult, like really strong in-group, out-group language, lingo that makes it hard for outsiders to understand what's going on. And then also like behavior change, that people tend to like isolate themselves from their friends and family and spend more and more of their time only with the group. What I have found interesting over the course of researching this book is that cults don't always look the way that you think that they will, right? You might have this idea of a cult being like a male leader on a rural commune with a beard and all his followers are dressed the same and they'd have this like strange religion. But the truth is, cults, one of their most constant qualities is that they adapt with the times. So actually, cults of today, cults of 10 years from now are going to look really different than what we expect. And they might be a lot more online. They might have female cult leaders, which are less common. I think that is something that makes Nicole and makes OneTaste unique and worthy of study. Yeah, they just might be a lot more digital. They might look like an Instagram influencer or a YouTube star. Or frankly, in my regular work at Bloomberg, I just published this big story about AI chatbots and the sort of psychological relationships that people have with them, which can sometimes lead to delusional thinking or mental health issues. And frankly, there are a lot of cult dynamics in those relationships as well, where people spend 10 plus hours a day speaking with this chatbot, and it makes them feel like it promises them that they've found some sort of special mission. It gradually isolates them from other sources of information or other relationships in their life because they're spending all this time talking to the chatbot. It makes them feel emotionally validated in a way that again, draws them away from other relationships. Like, these dynamics are going to be showing up in unexpected places. And that is something that I hope people learn from the book. Is like, a cult doesn't always look the way that you think that it might.
I think we're sort of trained to understand that a cult leader has similar personalities, or I should say, cult leaders of different cults have similar personalities in that they have, I guess, a strong narcissism. I think that's one that is typically prevalent in cult leaders. Did you find any of those patterns with Nicole?
I'm not a psychologist, so definitely can't diagnose or make any sort of statements like that. I did find that Nicole was a fascinating person, who many people described to me, like how charismatic she was, how compelling she was. And she's very smart. Some of the things that she did was she really knew how to market orgasmic meditation to a mainstream audience in the 2010s. Basically, like, she knew that it was necessary to make this kind of confronting practice feel as safe and palatable as possible. That's why there's all these restrictions, like, oh, it's only 15 minutes. We're going to follow this specific script. The promise was essentially you're going to be able to own with anyone, like, even if it's someone that you don't know. I think calling it orgasmic meditation was really smart. There are all these things that Nicole did to rebrand this clitoral stroking practice, which she actually picked up from a couple other groups that preceded her. She rebranded it orgasmic meditation. She made herself the face of it, which I think was really smart. Like, those other groups were run by men. This one's run by a woman. All of a sudden it feels more wholesome, whether that's accurate or not. I think people will project that image on a group like that. Nicole herself was just, again, based on all the stories that I heard from people I interviewed and videos and hours of videos that I watched of her lecturing, like, she's a really good speaker. She really knows how to, like, lock in and put attention on someone and really make them feel special. And one thing that came up when I was talking to cult researchers, which I thought was interesting, and I often, tell people when they ask me about cults, is that one of them told me that basically charisma is more accurately seen as a quality that exists between two people rather than in one person themselves. So it might be that you and I have a relationship, Tim, in which you think that I'm very charismatic. And that means that, like, charisma is present in that relationship. It doesn't necessarily mean that I, Ellen, am charismatic to everyone that I meet, because a lot of people will meet someone who is maybe, like, accused of being a cult leader. They might meet them and say, like, wow, that person is so charismatic. And of course we have this idea of a charismatic leader at the top of groups like this. But other people might meet them and be like, this person does nothing for me. And I don't want that to negate the experience that some people have, where when they see this person, they feel incredibly drawn to them. They trust them. They want to, like, give over some of their autonomy to this person because they trust that they're going to, like, guide them with wisdom and care into, like, some new domain. I think there were many, many people who met Nicole and for various reasons felt that pull of charisma. And there were also plenty of people who met her and were like, this isn't for me. But, I never want people to assume that everyone who, like, joins a group like this has the same experience. Some people have quite a, like, light touch experience, and some people get in really deep and they have a totally different experience. And both of those exist at the same time, and the existence of one doesn't negate the existence of the other.
And we'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsors.
Thanks to our sponsors, and now we're back to the program.
And I apologize for the, ignorance of my next question, but this isn't something that is supposed to be taken as sexual. So I'm just wondering, how did they and how does the public look at this? And, like, how did you think that this isn't sexual? How is that message communicated?
Lance, that's a good question. Yes, for those who aren't familiar with OneTaste and kind of the way that they frame or orgasmic meditation, they, have consistently said that, this 15-minute session in which one person's stroking the genitals of the other should not be thought of as sex. Yeah, basically it's not sex. This is what they say. They say it's not sex. They say it's not foreplay. It's not meant, they do try to tell people, like, don't do it in a bed. Instead they have this, like, nest setup that is kind of the standard setup with a yoga mat and certain pillows and things like that. So don't do it in a bed. Don't use it as foreplay. Like, don't transition from that to other sexual acts. And it's one of these, like, marketing spins of OneTaste that I think they were quite successful with, in that I think they really did manage to get a lot of people to think of it more as a practice. And again, if you're a trained meditator, that does kind of make sense on some level. You're like, you might be sitting down to do this practice. It's something that you would do every day, not because you're like in the mood or feel like an urge to do so. And they would encourage you to be able to do it with different partners, kind of regardless of how you feel. There's no goal to like reach climax or to perform in any certain way or to feel any certain thing. And instead, it's just meant to be like, we're just going to feel the sensations in our body. You know, anyone who's done sitting meditation will recognize that framework and that concept. At the same time, of course, you're asking a very obvious question, which is like many people will look at this and be like, it's genital stroking. Of course it's sex. In some way, both of those are true. Like, I think they were, you know, trying to spin it in one way. And there's some truth to that, and I can see it. And at the same time, if you zoom out, any person who looks at this action, I think quite reasonably can say this is sex. The one thing that ended up being kind of interesting that demonstrates that kind of gap in understanding. One of the things that I learned when I was reporting that first story is that OneTaste had actually had an out-of-court settlement with a former employee back in 2015 who claimed that she had been pressured to own and have sex with her coworkers and like with her manager. This had happened kind of within the workplace, and it was, you know, an example of, sexual harassment. And what's interesting is, you know, some of the leaders of OneTaste had been on the record in other stories about OneTaste talking about how, you know, to them, an OM session is a way to get energy flowing between two people again. So they would say like, oh yeah, you know, if two of our employees are not seeing eye to eye on a topic, we might suggest to them that they OM together. We don't do it in the office, but like, yeah, we might say OM together. It'll like help fix sort of interpersonal employee problems. If you are immersed in the world of OneTaste, that does feel normal, because it was true that people were, you know, in that world, they were kind of OMing with everyone and their coworkers and people who might be technically considered their managers. To be clear, that is like based on what people told me that is what happened. But if you switch your hat really quickly and you become like an employment lawyer, someone comes to you and tells you like, well, this is what was happening inside the workplace. Because keep in mind, OneTaste was a company that was selling courses on OM. So it's like there were workers and employees and independent contractors and things like that. All of a sudden you look at that and you're like, wait, what do you mean the employees were stroking each other's genitals as part of their work? Like that is... that just like is not, you know, that's really not what like is expected to happen in a workplace. And so I think like it does show that gap, you know, that was not seen as strange. I don't know if I explained that correctly, but hopefully that helped.
Definitely. And I really think that should be implemented in like fire departments and police stations across the nation.
I'll let you take charge of that
one. Be your next article.
Yep.
Can you tell us about the financial aspects of this? How does someone begin paying money to this group, and then how does that sort of get its hooks into you?
Great question. So I'll talk you through like a typical person's involvement in OneTaste. And again, this is not everyone's, but based on speaking with a lot of people, this is a pattern that I feel like many people follow. Maybe you're like new to a city, or you've had some life transition, like you just ended a relationship and you're kind of, you know, looking for a new something in your life. And maybe you've also had complications in your relationship with your sexuality. So for example, according to research, something like 10 to 15% of American women have trouble having an orgasm. Or you might be someone who struggles with performance anxiety during sex, you know, or maybe you're in a long-term marriage and like the spark is kind of gone, something that makes you think like, I want to better understand my sexuality. So you're at a transition point, maybe you have this yearning. And, you know, you might encounter someone who tells you about like, oh, have you ever heard of orgasmic meditation? You know, there were some people who heard about it when they took yoga teacher training. Some people heard about it from a friend. Some people like matched with someone on Tinder who turns out they were involved with OneTaste and like told them, oh, you should come to this, you know, introductory evening where we're just, you know, everyone's clothes are going to stay on, but we're just going to like tell you a little bit about the orgasmic meditation philosophy. This first evening class is quite gentle. It's like you'll play communication games and they're a little spicy, but like, you know, nothing crazy happens. And then you meet these nice people and they all seem really excited to meet you and they're very friendly, lots of eye contact, and they kind of invite you to come back, maybe take an introductory OM course or come help them run their food volunteering thing that happens every week. Or they come back and help volunteer to like help us run another course. And so then maybe you take an introductory OM course, which costs roughly $200, and it's all day Saturday, and you learn about orgasmic meditation. You even see a demo of like a woman who gets up on a massage table, takes off her pants, and a man comes and strokes her for 15 minutes. You get to see what OM is like. And you're like, wow, that was kind of crazy, but like, I'm intrigued. And then you take more classes. Maybe the next thing is like a weekend-long course about, advanced communication. Once you get a little involved, there are more courses that you can take. They tend to be more and more expensive. And for people who are really drawn to the community and the practice, they also tend to get involved in the group in other ways. So people tend to move out of wherever they were living previously and move into one of the communal residences with other OneTaste members, whether those are employees or frequent customers, that kind of thing. They tended to live in these like informal group houses. And then maybe you quit your job and you start working for the sales team at OneTaste. And then gradually it's like you live with these people, you work with them, you just kind of stop hanging out as much with your friends and family who kind of don't understand this new orgasmic thing in your life. And you're like, well, they don't really get it. I'd rather spend time with people who are like on this path. And so you naturally might distance yourself from your other connections and relationships, and you just become more involved in this. And so I've spoken to many former employees of OneTaste, and even when people were working for the company, they were also often paying significant sums of money to the company in order to buy more courses. So for example, like the coaching program, which was this like long program, which could last 6 months or more, often cost $10,000 or $15,000. There were some intensives that cost upwards of $20,000 or $30,000. Some employees would take these courses more than once. So it wasn't even like if you took one, then you were kind of done. And then often you were also working for the company as well, trying to sell those courses at the same time to other customers. And so that was the way that the company worked financially for a while. And there were lots of former employees who also alleged, both to me and in court testimony later at the criminal trial, that they were also underpaid, for the amount of hours that they were expected to work, that they were not paid correctly for that time. And yeah, that's kind of like the financial arc of the company later on. In the earlier years, when OneTaste was just getting off the ground and had a harder time making money, they had a different system, which was basically Nicole Danon had met this investor named Rhys Jones. And he had, according to my reporting and according to people who told me about this, he fronted the company money in its early years to help keep it afloat. And in exchange, people say that he was essentially paid back in sexual favors from OneTaste employees, so that they put on elaborate BDSM scenes for him to celebrate his birthday. And one of the main allegations of the criminal case was also that there were women who had been employees of OneTaste who were essentially asked, and the prosecutors would argue, psychologically groomed to be Mr. Jones's sexual handlers in order to basically service him sexually every day as part of their role at the company. So that was a big part of the criminal trial, and also something that people told me about when I was researching the book. Prosecutors would allege that that is a way that the company kept itself afloat financially in the early years before it managed to make enough money from selling more expensive courses.
How did this guy Rhys come into the picture in the first place? Where did she meet him?
I think there have been a few different stories as to how they met. People had told me that he was interested in some of the courses at OneTaste. So I don't know exactly how they met. It could have been at a party or maybe at a OneTaste course, but he was around and in the scene in San Francisco. And then when they met, they kind of immediately hit it off. They started dating, but in addition to that, again, people have told me that she sort of supplemented their relationship by encouraging female OneTaste employees to have sex with him in various ways. Either that was oming or other sex acts.
We'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsor.
And a thank you to our sponsors. Back to the program.
Now, with the combination of employment, finances, and sex, I feel like we're getting kind of close to either sex work or sex trafficking. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Okay, I guess I'll tackle sex work first. I mean, certainly I think there are people who I interviewed either had the role of being a handler for Mr. Jones or had also been encouraged to have sex or own with customers in order to bring in money and resources for the company. It's complicated because I think some of those people I spoke to might use words like sex work to describe their experience within OneTaste. I don't know. I guess there's a lot of potential connotations associated with that. Everyone kind of has their own individual take on. Nicole has also been quite open about having been a sex worker in the past, in her 20s and in her earlier years. She has told other people that she worked as a stripper and that she worked as an escort. And in some sense, things that Nicole did and things that she talked about to her students were automatically seen as like kind of aspirational because she was really elevated as the leader of the group. So a lot of people heard her talk about her sex work and heard her talk about other sexual experiments that she had done in her life and took away from that this idea that like actually pursuing those things might be a good way for me to open up my sexuality or to access a sort of sexual liberation. So, in that sense, that was like, it was just an interesting environment in which people might have had like quite open minds to sex work. Sex trafficking, I really want to be careful about that because, it's like a criminal allegation that has not been made against OneTaste. So, and I'm not a lawyer, so like I believe there are kind of like specific criteria that need to be met to say sex trafficking. And to be clear, that's not what prosecutors charge them with. They charge them with forced labor conspiracy, which I'll spare you the details, but basically conspiracy means you may not have done the crime, but we allege that you schemed in order to do the crime with at least one other person. And then forced labor is a federal crime, which generally means you are obtaining someone's labor using unlawful means. The way that it was applied at OneTaste was basically arguing that there was a conspiracy to obtain some of these employees' labor through serious harm or threats of serious harm. And serious harm under the statute can be defined quite broadly to mean not just physical, but also psychological, financial, reputational, and otherwise. So it's complicated, but keep in mind, like there was a very, very thorough presentation of the statute made to the 12 jurors, and they went and did their juror job and came back and said, yes, we think that both of these women are guilty of forced labor conspiracy. So we think that they conspired to obtain forced labor. Sex trafficking was not mentioned in the trial. And so for that reason, I will steer clear of it. What allegedly happened at OneTaste is obviously like in a gray area of what people might call sex work, or, it's just complicated. And I think that's part, that nuance is part of what drew me to the story, not just about these alleged crimes, but also just about the psychological experience of it all. Like I spoke to so many people who felt both like they had experienced harm and healing at the same time within this group. It's definitely not black and white, and nothing in life really is, but this one in particular, I think is challenges people with its grayness.
Can we just talk a little bit more about that forced labor conspiracy? What specifically were they asking people to do and forcing them to do in exchange for what that was benefiting the company?
Great question. So prosecutors would say that the alleged forced labor was both sexual labor and non-sexual labor. So again, if you talk to people who were really in that inner circle of OneTaste, or, who were really involved in the group, they testified about being asked, as some examples of non-sexual labor, they testified about being asked to like do sort of like housework, taking care of various needs of Nicole's, like, doing sales, like just doing this kind of work that helped the company run. So some of the specific allegations that came up in trial were, again, that these people were asked to do this work and were not paid properly. I would say the criminal trial got a lot more into the like kind of the like workplace details of it. In the book, that's not so much, I think, not because I don't think it's important, but I think there were other things that I would rather discuss, and it was perhaps more important to the criminal case. But yes, some of the labor that was alleged was, non-sexual. And in a specific example for these women who were serving as Rhys Jones's handlers, not all of the work that they were expected to do was sexual. Some of it was like walking and taking care of his dog, making him dinner, like taking care of his house. And then some of the labor that was alleged was sexual. So there were women and former employees who testified at trial about, again, this expectation that if they were a handler for Rhys Jones, that they would service him sexually every day. And so they did get into the specifics of what that looked like. Maybe I'll spare your readers that, or your listeners that. But I think, some of the other witnesses also testified about sexual labor that they felt was expected of them in order to keep the company going. So as an example, like being expected to with interested customers who were like maybe going to buy a course and needed a partner to learn the practice with. Many women testified about being expected to then own with someone, even if they didn't want to, as sort of part of their job for like bringing in sales and like bringing in revenue for the company.
Tell me about how this story is timely.
Well, I mean, the criminal trial really just wrapped this summer. And I think everyone who has like ever touched OneTaste like was really, I guess I feel like I was quite invested in understanding what was coming up at the trial. Like it was interesting to see how both the defense and the prosecution were going to try to argue about like what had happened there. And then, yeah, I mean, the sentencing is still like TBD, which I think has been surprising. It was originally scheduled for September. It keeps getting delayed for various reasons. And so, you know, these two women are currently in MDC, which is like a federal jail in Brooklyn, you know, where other kind of high profile people have been held in the past, like Sam Bankman-Fried and Diddy, I think. It feels like the story is still going, like there isn't this resolution about what kind of sentence these women will get, what is going to kind of be the conclusion of this criminal trial. And then on a broader note, like one of the reasons that the story of OneTaste is relevant, not just for today, but for the next 10 or 20 years is, again, this idea that cults are going to keep changing shape. They're kind of shape-shifting organizations, right? Like, you know, I feel like the story helps people understand that cults might look different than they expect, that they might show up with like a leader who just doesn't look like what you imagine, you know, a cult leader of 40 or 50 years ago. This idea that like, yeah, they might come in unexpected packages. And also that people are lonelier. And I think zooming out, it's like we need to understand that part of what helps protect us from groups that promise connection and belonging, but at a really high cost, is having that type of connection and belonging in our lives elsewhere, so that it is not this draw that can lead people into like vulnerable spots. I wish it weren't the case, but I do think that more people than ever might be at risk of joining a harmful group that promises like connection to other humans, you know, a fix for loneliness, a fix for like relationships, because people do have that yearning. It's like a natural human desire that is really, really deeply ingrained in us. And there's always going to be someone who is going to come along and promise that they can sell you the answer. It's just important to be aware like that, that is potentially like a situation in which you might be at risk. Now,
the forced labor and the financial misuse and the criminal element aside, do you think that the technique itself works? Like the OM technique itself works? Does it actually bring people closer? Does it resolve problems? Does it open you up to a sexual awakening?
I mean, I think from what I've seen, from the people I've spoken to, you know, many people told me that orgasmic meditation was helpful to them, that doing this practice did bring them some sort of new insight about their sexuality, helped them attune their body to like better feel these types of sensations in their body. Like, you know, I'm not like a serious meditator, but I am a pretty regular one. And I think anyone who has done that recognizes that daily practice on something like this, where you really are training your brain to like focus on certain sensations or just noticing, is a really crucial skill that can open up a lot of things in your life, like just enhancing your own ability to like tap into your awareness. And so I guess my short answer is like, I don't think that there's anything inherently harmful about orgasmic meditation. And that is actually something that former practitioners have told me, that they mourn about this whole story arc, which is that this practice that they feel could have been transformative and healing for so many people is kind of inextricably tied with this company, OneTaste, that they feel was exploitative and abusive and harmful. And so I think it's important to try to separate like the benefits of the practice from the company that was propagating it. That being said, there are also people who told me they felt like the use of the practice itself within the company, for example, this is speculative, but they would tell me things like, oh, we think it releases a lot of oxytocin and therefore like makes people vulnerable to like being upsold more expensive packages. So you can see how like maybe aspects of the practice could have been used in harmful ways. I think the truth is like, there's a lot of reasons that people were drawn to orgasmic meditation. Like, I think that goallessness of it is quite appealing to people who might have struggled with performance anxiety during sex. And another thing that I haven't spoken about yet, but is quite important, is the idea that orgasmic meditation explicitly does not have an expectation of reciprocal pleasure giving. So for example, like a woman who receives this like pleasurable sexual touch from a stroking partner, once those 15 minutes are over, the explicit understanding in an OM is that she doesn't owe her partner anything. Not a hug, a handshake, a thank you, a date, more sex. And I think for a lot of women, that can be a pretty revelatory idea because you're just brought up in a world where you're socially conditioned to believe that if someone gives you sexual pleasure, you owe them something in return. So for a lot of women, they described how freeing that was. A lot of women talked to me about how when they did their first OMs, that they cried and that they just like felt this sort of like release, or that it felt like this really like healing experience. Not everyone felt that way, but enough people told me about that makes me think that there probably was a lot of benefit in it. And one of the things I've come to understand through writing this book is that most, if not all, successful cults have a lot of wisdom at the center of what they're teaching. Then they might the packaging around it might include things that are harmful or hurtful, but if there's not some value to that original idea or to the like essence of whatever philosophy they're teaching, it's unlikely that they're going to be that successful because like what's drawing people in. And so that is also this ambiguity that I think exists at the center of a lot of these groups, is that the ideas that they teach are not obviously all bad. And in fact, many of them have a lot of value, deep at the core. And the complication is just trying to separate that out or trying to understand that, certain parts of this might be helpful, but if taken too far, they can be really harmful. Humans are just not so good with that ambiguity. So like it trips a lot of people up, but it's, I think, undeniable that is the case for a lot of these teachings.
And what was the trial like?
For me personally, it was a fascinating experience. By the time that the trial started, my book was mostly finished. Like I had written this whole draft, revised it many times, spoken to, at that point, it was like over 125 people who had been close to Nicole or to OneTaste, reviewed like hundreds of hours of video and audio and all these documents. And I really felt like I knew a lot about this story, but it was all from my like journalist lens, which is of course my profession and the way that I was approaching trying to tell this story. The trial was taking place in New York. It was in Brooklyn. It was summertime. Obviously, the setting is quite beautiful. I don't know if you've ever been to the federal courthouse in Brooklyn, but there's a beautiful park outside. And so it was like I would show up in the morning and walk through this beautiful park, and then you walk into the doors of the courtroom, and it's quite austere. Like you have to turn in your phone. You like, I don't know, the hallways are very echoey. It's like you sit in this courtroom, no natural light. It's like, it sort of feels like you're in a casino, except really the vibe is quite different. And then you're there and you're watching these proceedings. And so for me personally, it was like, I really recognized, I recognized many of the people who were in the gallery every day, not just other journalists, but like OneTaste supporters, people who had been involved in the company for a long time. Many of the witnesses, I was familiar with their stories already, but it was interesting to hear like, how did they show up on the stand? What was cross-examination like? And I don't know if you've ever sat through a trial. This is not my first one, but it's not like it's not like I do this all the time, but I was reminded of how, criminal proceedings can be both very, very high stakes and also quite boring at the same time. Like there are many, many hours devoted to lawyers like arguing about proceedings that can be quite in the weeds. Of course, that's their job. Yeah, there's a lot of proceedings that kind of go in between these moments of really like high excitement. But it was also just fascinating to observe Nicole in the courtroom every day. Like she was very animated. She would often turn around and like wave and smile to her supporters in the gallery. When someone new walked into the courtroom, a lot of people would turn around and look and be like, who is it? Let's like assess who is coming in. I spoke to jurors after the trial was over, and several of them told me that they noticed that Nicole was often looking at them, like she would try to make eye contact with them during the trial. Some of them were kind of perturbed by that. As a journalist, it's very rich material. Like you can just watch how people are carrying themselves during the trial. And you're constantly trying to also get a sense by watching the jury, how are they reacting to this? Remember, this is 12 people plus a handful of alternates who had never heard about orgasmic meditation before this trial. And then all of a sudden they're like in a courtroom hearing about it for 8 hours a day. Like it can be quite long. As a reporter, you're also trying to look at their faces and scrutinize and try to guess, how are they feeling? Like, do they seem do they seem excited? Are they taking notes? Do they seem bored? Like what's going on? So as a reporter, it's a fascinating experience. I was grateful that I got to like witness it. It was interesting to see the overlap between some of what was testified at trial and like what people had already told me about in the book. And I really didn't know what the verdict would be until the very end.
What's the attached time that she could do for this?
It could be up to 20 years for both Nicole and Rachel.
Wow.
In federal prison, which is quite serious. Yeah.
Wow. And she's in her mid-50s now, right?
You might argue mid or late. I think she's 58. Rachel is younger.
Yeah, that's an incredible story. Thank you so much for joining us here to tell us a bit about it and a bit about your book. What is next for you?
I mean, this book has been a real passion project of mine, and I am looking forward to getting it out in the world. Love to hear from readers. So if anyone's listening to this and they end up reading the book, please send me an email. I'd really love to know what you think. And yeah, you hopefully can find Empire of Orgasm, not just at Amazon bookshop, but also your local, indie bookseller. There's also the audiobook, which I narrated. There's ebook, there's going to be a lot of different forms in which you can read it. It's just been a big goal of mine to write a book for a long time. And I think that this has been the reporting experience of a lifetime. So I'm just excited to share it with people and hear what they think.